Welcome to the second of our Eriksholm Update videos. My name is James Hart and I'm the Senior Director here. We started these videos at the end of last year to try and showcase a little bit more of the research activities that we're doing and give us the opportunity of having a little bit more of a deep dive. Today, the focus is going to be on communication. And I'm going to invite three of the scientists here in Eriksholm to give their perspective on communication science and specifically around communication behavior, around how we can measure communication difficulty using various different physiological measures, but also how maybe we can decode someone's intention in a communication situation. Ultimately, what we're trying to do, of course, is to build future hearing aid technology that's better able to support a hearing impaired individual's communication needs. Our ability to communicate is extremely important for our mental health, our well-being, and this is especially true as we age. Interactive communication is a two-way process whereby we exchange ideas, information, or messages. And it actually remains, unfortunately, one of the greatest challenges to hearing aid users. It's a lot more than just understanding or perceiving speech. That would be passive listening. Now, this complexity is not captured in the way that we evaluate hearing aid technology today. That would be speech and noise tests. I would like now to introduce Lena-Marie Huttner. She's a scientist working in Eriksholm, working with interactive communication. Specifically, she's looking at how we can measure how difficult a conversation is during its course, specifically using objective measures. So welcome, Lena-Marie. As I said, your project is sort of focusing specifically on communication difficulty. How do you even begin to define such a subjective concept like that, and how do you possibly link that to, objective physiological measures?
That is a very good question, and it's far from trivial. I mean, it seems so obvious, right? A person with hearing impairment will complain about having difficulty participating in a conversation. But when you kind of try to understand what that means, that's when things start getting interesting. From more qualitative research that looks at communication difficulty, we know that it's a multifaceted phenomenon that many factors play into. How engaged do people feel? How stressful is a situation? How frustrated are they by not understanding someone? And as you mentioned, this isn't really captured well by just hearing in noise tests, because communication is this sort of synergistic joint action where two or more people interact with the goal of understanding one another. And it's not just something that people feel, it's also something that they compensate for when they talk to someone in a challenging environment. So what we will do is to put people in challenging environments with background noise and measure how they adapt to the noise and also to one another. How do they signal that something might be difficult? How does the other person help a hearing impaired participant understand better? And we also measure how stressed they are by looking at their heart rate, by looking at their skin conductivity, basically how much do they sweat in a challenging environment. And then we will try to link that to their own experience by asking them how they felt, how they perceived the situation.
Okay, thank you. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the types of experiments that you're running and more specifically about how, why you're doing this in an interactive way and rather than other ways that you could run the experiments.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Having two people communicate with one another, you have to relinquish a lot of control over the experiment. The reason why we do it, so what we do is run dyadic experiments, what I call them. You have two people, usually hearing impaired and normal hearing, communicate with one another. And we put them in challenging environments, which means we give them a lot of background noise. We either give the hearing impaired person a hearing aid or we don't give them a hearing aid to have sort of different levels of what we would think is a difficult environment. And we will measure their speech, we will record their video to see how much they maybe compensate by gesturing. We also look at how stressed they are through physiological measures. And as you mentioned, that also means that we might not have as much control. Sometimes we can't really pinpoint down the source of a compensatory mechanism. Do they react to the noise? Do they react to the interlocutor and whatever they might be doing? But we still try to measure it. And then it's sort of a push and pull, right? In science, you find something, you find a measure, and then you might have to take a step back and put it into an individual, more controlled environment.
Yeah.
And figure out what that measure that you found actually means, how variable it is, and what people react to.
Super, thank you. Yeah, no, it's excellent. So, I mean, finally, I mean, as you're relatively new to working here in Eriksholm, for those who are watching who might be in academia, might be looking at what their next steps career-wise, how was it for you to make a transition from, a very much an academic background to sort of the Eriksholm research environment?
I mean, Eriksholm made it easy. I still get to do high quality research. I would say the biggest difference is a change in perspective. Mm-hmm. My background is in psycholinguistics and phonetics, which are more abstract theoretical fields. And usually you take a theory, you derive hypothesis, you run an experiment, and then you go back to the theory. Like, what do the results tell us about the phenomenon that we're researching? Yeah. And I would say that last step is a bit different here, where we say, okay, how do the results actually help us understand how we can help someone? Mm-hmm. How can we turn this into technology? That's a bit of a shift in thinking, I would say.
Yeah, so how are you doing that with your project?
I would say in the short to medium term, it would be a great testing tool if we found an objective measure that tells us that a person is having difficulty in communicating. Mm-hmm. Then we could use that to test new technology. Yeah.
Super. Well, thank you very much for your time, Lena-Marie.
Thank you.
Yeah. Interactive communication is much more than passive listening. When we have a conversation, we're often thinking about what we're going to say next, looking for cues about when we can, take turns or change turns with who's actually speaking. We might be relying on our memory to give context about what's being said. We might be observing the other person's behavior to pick up relevant and important communication cues, but we also might be adapting to the environment that we're in. In other words, we're relying on quite a number of sort of high-level cognitive processes to help us in that communication situation. I would like now to introduce Martha Shiell. She's a senior scientist here at Eriksholm, and she's actually working with these different sort of cognitive aspects of communication. And specifically, she's working with how we make use of our eyes when we observe an active communication situation. So welcome, Martha. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how we make use of cognition in active communication?
Sure. You already touched on a lot of cognitive processes that we think are involved when people are actively communicating in their everyday life. And I think we could safely say that communication is the brain in action. So it's really involving everything, all the processes that we could possibly have going on. The challenge isn't that just that all of this is going on at the same time. It's also that we have to do it on a really tight time schedule. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. If the brain decides that it wants to start speaking, we typically say that it takes about 600 milliseconds from when the brain sends the signal to the motor system before the sound is actually produced. So 600 milliseconds, it might sound like it's pretty fast, but if we put that into context of how fast a conversation is going, it's not a lot of time. So in English, if two people are speaking, we typically say that there's about 200 milliseconds only between when one person finishes their speaking turn and the next person begins. Mm-hmm. So that's not a lot of time. And that means that if I want to speak next, I actually need to already know what I want to say and send the motor signals to start that speech processing even before you have finished your turn. So it's really challenging, and you can imagine it's even more challenging if you're dealing with impaired auditory information that's coming in. So one of the ways that the brain deals with this challenge is by actually actively predicting in real time what we think our conversation partner is about to say next and when they're going to finish their speaking turn. And that's one of the things that I'm focusing on my research.
Extremely interesting. So why do you then take an approach where you're measuring eye gaze in situations where people are just observing an interactive communication as opposed to, the actual having them communicate directly?
Of course, this is the classic trade-off between ecological validity and experiment control. So indeed, we are working with paradigms where people are watching two people having a conversation. that was pre-recorded and it's being presented on a screen.
Right.
This is a big step back from actually being involved in the conversation. But when we do it this way, it gives us a little bit more opportunity to measure something specific and also measure something like in a realistic experiment setup, something that we could easily replicate in many different situations. So we hope that this will give us more insight onto specific processes that we're interested in.
Super, I get it. Thank you very much for your time, Martha.
Thank you.
So there's quite a lot of research at Eriksholm looking at both the behavior and objective physiological responses in hearing impaired individuals when they're engaged in either an active communication situation or when they're observing some kind of interactive communication. I would like now to introduce Sergi Griful, one of our senior research managers. Sergi has actually been working for quite a number of years in this field, looking at different aspects around communication and about trying to sort of decode an individual's intent in the moment. Welcome, Sergi. So how do you see Eriksholm practically building on this theoretical knowledge that we're establishing now in communication behavior to help us build next generation hearing aid technology to help support hearing impaired individuals' specific communication needs?
So as you see, a lot of the research that we actually do is around defining and measuring communication difficulty. And the way I think that this can actually make inways into audiology, hearing aid technology, is basically two. One is in hearing aid rehabilitation, and the other one is in hearing aid automatics.
Yep.
So let me present you the first one. So today's hearing aids, they actually log a lot of information of the environment and so on. And some of this information is actually shown to the audiologist. So wouldn't it be great if the hearing aid could actually get a proxy, get an estimate of the experience communication difficulty of the individual? So if we have that communication difficulty log, actually we could use this in the traditional hearing aid rehabilitation process. So imagine a situation that an audiologist is with the end user, with their client, and this audiologist actually sees that 80% of the time that this individual is in communication settings, they are struggling.
Yep.
Then that can actually trigger discussions around communication strategies.
Yep.
Where do you sit in a restaurant? How do you position yourself? As well as actually a bit more active things like maybe suggesting different hearing aid programs. You may benefit from a stronger noise reduction in communication settings.
So both a counseling tool as well as maybe looking at different fitting strategies that you might employ for an individual.
Exactly, and I think that's the second part that I mentioned before is the hearing aid automatics.
Yeah.
So if you look at how hearing aids work today, they basically adapt the, let's call it like the level of support that they provide to the end user, mainly to the environment. I am in a more noisy situation, then I boost noise reduction. And more modern technology can adapt to some extent even to behaviors of the end users.
Yep.
What we're proposing here is go even further, one step further, and say like, can we use these communication difficulty logs to adapt in the moment the level of support that the end user gets?
Okay. So do you see then anything that we can realistically do beyond that, just sort of adapting existing hearing aid sound processing algorithms? Can we do more in the future, do you think?
Definitely.
If we have this knowledge.
Definitely. So I think this for us is the first stage.
Yeah.
The next natural stage is like once you have a measure of communication difficulty, then you can start studying which kind of manipulations can you put in the signal to minimize this difficulty.
Yep.
Let me try to put a very simple example or a simpler example for that matter. So we very recently started a PhD project, or we're about to start a PhD project with Associate Professor Lauren Hadley from the University of Nottingham, where what we're actually trying to do is we look at specific sentence type questions.
Yep.
You can have like, why do you, or yes or no questions. And then what we study is the usage of, can we manipulate a bit acoustic cues, prosodic cues, more specifically intonation on these questions to make the end of the question more predictable for the end user.
Yeah.
So this is a bit the next stage, basically trying to
So you're not trying to make the hearing aid intelligent to what's being said, you're just trying to sort of accentuate some of the natural cues that are in speech to make them easier to understand. Is that the
Precisely. I think that's a good way to put it. So basically, we envision that potentially hearing aids could just do subtle modifications in the intonation of speech so that it makes it easier for the person in the other end to predict the turn end.
Super. Well, how did this project come about, actually?
So this is a funny situation. I mean, like, we do have very close collaboration with different researchers all over the globe. With Lauren Hadley, we're actually discussing a potential stay for her here at Eriksholm, and that is something that came out of these discussions. So I think that this is actually a quite unique opportunity that we offer at Eriksholm. We had a bunch of visiting scholars that come here and stay for a few months, and it is really a win-win situation where researcher gets a bit closer to the industry, they understand a bit better how we operate, and we get insights from experts on the field.
Fantastic. Sounds like a good project.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your time, Sergi.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much for taking the time to watch this video. We hope you've enjoyed this particular topic on interactive communication. If you have a wish or a desire for us to cover other topics in future videos, please reach out. You can always go to our website to find out more about what we do. And with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.